The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to our fourth week, topic 4. We've got our final webinar on tonight, well, it is tonight for me. It'll be different times for all of you. Thanks for tuning in. A few people are still logging in. And before we kick off with anything more exciting than we've got already, I want to just explain what's going on with the live chat that we're trying to get going. We haven't been successful to get the software to effectively allow your input to be visible to everyone else. So this is the experiment that we're trying to make work, and so far we haven't been able to get the interface at your end to be able to make this work so that everyone can see each other's comments. So we have tried to, we had a go at that a few minutes ago. For those of you that are just logging in, we have tried to get that going, and a few of you, I'm sure, we're looking around for the box, where do I put this in, etc. And we can't get that to appear for you at the moment. So, but fear not, the questions box is still the place where all the information that you put in is going to come through to us. We're going to keep with our previous format, which is that we'll raise any of the questions that we can, all the interesting and all the good questions that come in, and there's usually plenty of them. We'll do our best to have a talk about them, answer the questions, and raise all the comments as we go. So we're going to stick with the same plan and format. And we'll go back to Citrix and give them some feedback on how we can try and get these other features working, which are currently not fully featured or not fully effective. So today we're going to talk about persuasion, buy-in, a fairly useful skill, a fairly useful concept to get our heads around. For those of you who had a listen to the pre-recorded audio, and I apologize, I know it was up there a couple of days late, but those of you who have had a chance to have a listen to that will have a bit of an understanding of what sort of direction we're going to take this today. So what we're going to uncover is whether or not there's any secret sauce for how to convince someone, how to persuade, how to have influence. Some would suggest there is. Perhaps it's not so much of a secret. Now, before we do that, let's go through the housekeeping as usual. We'll go through the initial things. Just to remind everybody, please use the questions box. Please put your comments, thoughts, opinions, anything you like in the questions box. We will answer them and deal with them as we go through during the discussion today. Those of you, I'm sure most of you have already, but the online portal is where you're going to find everything. There'll be discussion forums up there. There's still discussions going on in the discussion forums there. And this is where tonight's or today's webinar recording will be uploaded. So you'll find it there. Now, before we kick off into topic 4, what I want to do is just do a very light and summary recap on where we've been so far. Now, I know we're only 3 weeks in, or 4 weeks now, but let's have a quick recap on some of the things that we've talked about. And this is just the slide itself is just a copy from what we've looked at previously. But I just want to cast your mind back to the things we've talked about. In week 1, we talked about some fairly deep ideas and some concepts that are not often thought about regarding the way in which communication works. So we looked at some of the interaction theories. We looked at how our minds process information when we communicate. We looked at the way the brain functions, and we looked at how information and knowledge gets exchanged between people. And then we talked a bit about language and writing. We talked about the importance of language. We talked about business and professional language. We talked a little bit there about how to influence the reader and what the written message is all about. We looked at digital communications, and we had a lengthy chat about things like email. We talked about social media. We talked about instant messaging. We talked about digital user experience. And today we're going to have a talk about persuasion and buy-in. So we're going to talk a little bit about solution selling, or some of the solution selling principles. So we're going to talk about salesmanship as a concept, but mostly we're going to go through the inherent processes of how to get buy-in and how to get persuasion working for you in having other people agree with your ideas. So we're going to talk in detail about spin as a model or a methodology for doing this. Now, before we go further, I want to throw up for you, and I want your comments and feedbacks on this, because I'd love to know what you feel about these threshold concepts. First of all, what's a threshold concept? This is talking about your learning process through the weeks that we've covered already, the topics we've covered already. A threshold concept in learning paradigm is something that changes the way you think in general. So a threshold concept is a concept or a principle or an idea that once we understand it, we have moved through a threshold into a new way of thinking about things. And it's irreversible. You can't unlearn something. But it's a concept that has fundamentally changed the way you approach something, the way you think about something. So we've got our ideas of what the threshold concepts might be for the topics that we've covered already. And this is an example of some of these threshold concepts, or you could call them the core concepts, the core principles. And if we just get these ideas across, and if we can satisfy ourselves that we understand this stuff, then maybe we've accomplished enough. So here's what we're thinking about. Communication psychology, 3 key points that were takeaways out of this. The responsibility for communication is with the sender. Point number 1. Number 2, when you communicate for a particular purpose, then it needs to be driven by the recipient. It's all about them. Communication, when you need to achieve something, has to take their perspective into account. And then we talked about the logical sequence of creating any form of transfer of knowledge goes through concept, context, and content. Now, in language and writing, week 2, we talked about writing what we want people to read, not what we want them to say. And there's an echo of that from what we talked about with communication psychology. It's about thinking from the recipient's point of view. We also said keeping language simple and professional, and in doing so, we have to review it. So simple, professional language, typically the most effective. And the third key concept that we had for this was having a purpose and planning the message around that purpose for any written communications, and make it easy for the other person to understand that message and therefore your purpose. Thirdly, 3 things that came out of digital communications for us. Things like email and messaging must be used within their real core purpose. Instant messaging is good for certain things. Let's keep it at that. Email, good for other certain things. Let's keep it for that. We talked about the fact that things that are digitally recorded, especially social media and professional media, is permanent and public. It's serious stuff, and it can affect our professional identity forever in the long term. And we looked at the vectors of change. So we talked about changes in what we know, changes in what we feel, and changes, therefore, in what we do. Now, if anyone's got any other threshold concepts that they feel are relevant or that they got out of it, or a different way of expressing any of these, throw them up in the questions box. Happy to have a chat about that as we go through. If there's any here that you don't agree with, or you don't find, or anything else, or anything that you do agree with, let us know. Put your thoughts in there. So if we're going to talk about influence, I want to just clarify what we mean by persuasion, because we're talking tonight about persuasion in particular. What do we mean by persuasion? Let's line it up against a couple of other forms of influence and make some comparative analysis between them. The kind of persuasion that we're looking for in this context is persuasion which is an influence that's gained by the presentation of evidence. So it's through the use of fact, it's through the use of actuality, it's through the use of things that are real and explicit. And it's through presenting those real and explicit facts that we want to persuade somebody else. It's different, for example, from manipulation, which some people would say that the difference in manipulation is more to do with intent, it's more to do with the purpose, it's more to do with a selfish purpose or something that might not be in the interests of the other person. But I think that's debatable. You can have manipulation that is a method of achieving influence, but your interests might be for the other person. You might have their interests at heart, but influence isn't working, so you trick them into doing what you believe is the right thing for them to do. Coercion is, of course, force, threat, consequence. Coercion is where we use other more direct, more fearful forms of influence to achieve things. So what we're trying to do here is say that persuasion is a method that is not manipulation, not coercion, and doesn't use any of that. John Hancock was he was actually quite a rich merchant in the early days before the American Revolution, during the time of the 13 colonies. One of the signatories to the Declaration of Independence. And his view was that the greatest ability in business is to get along with others and to influence their actions. That was his perspective, that our ability to get along and influence other people's actions is the greatest ability in business. I mean, do we think of that today in our normal function, in the professional world that we live in, all the effort we put into gaining skills and knowledge? Do we think of our ability to get along and influence as being our greatest strength or our most valid or valuable skill? Let's look at some of the principles that we're going to toy with regarding persuasion. What we're trying to do is break down the concepts of how we should think about the idea of persuasion, how we should think about the process of persuasion, and what are the things that should be foremost in our minds as we go through this process. If we're going to use persuasion, if we're going to use fact, if we're going to present knowledge and information, we need to be clear on what we want to do with the influence we're going to get, our motivation, our purpose, our reason for doing this. So we might have higher goals, we might have neutral entities, we might be doing so in the interests of the organization, the company, the business that we're a part of, the industry, the institution. It could be the group, the harmony, the country, whatever it is that we are collectively a part of. And that kind of purpose is above either of us. It's above us, and it's usually above the person whom we're trying to influence. That's not to say that more narrow and specific reasons for influence are invalid, but they're a different purpose. If we're looking for influence for our purposes, if we want our project to succeed, we want our idea, we want our proposal to fly, we want our opportunity to be realized, that's still very valid. And if we're using persuasion principles, then we're going to be doing it, presumably, the right way. But being clear on what we want will make it very clear that as we get the influence that we need or that we're looking for, it gets applied in the right direction. So we need to be clear on what our actual goal and outcomes are in any process we go through. Specifically clear. Once we're clear on the actual goal, clear on the outcomes, we can create a logic that takes us there. We can create a logic that takes someone else on the same journey with us, that takes them through the same mental processes that we went through. Now, the hard part about this for many of us is that when we become convinced of something, when we become convinced of the value of an idea, we are not usually consciously aware of the logical process that we go through or that we went through in order to achieve that understanding and that sense of persuasion of ourselves about that idea. But there was a logical process. We did go through a logical process. And an echo of that is what we need to tap into and be aware of to help others go through a logical process. Because for anyone to reach any conclusion, if that conclusion is going to survive any kind of test, it needs to be something that they have a degree of confidence in. And they're only going to have a degree of confidence in any of their own conclusions if they feel they've followed a suitable, progressive, logical path to reach a conclusion. So the logic in persuasion is essential, and not just having logic, but having it unroll in the right order. What this means is we're using a constructivist logic principle. What's constructivist logic? Constructivism or constructivist learning is a process of learning which says that any new knowledge, any new awareness of information is built upon what we already know. So the way in which the human mind learns anything is by association and relation to what our knowledge already is, what we already understand. So we build upon the existing. So if we accept this as a mental technique for learning anything, if someone is going to learn the logic of our idea, of what we're trying to present, of what we want them to understand, then we need to construct that logic in a sensible manner, in a proper sequence. And this is where we use things like concept, context, content. We use the framework, the concept as a starting point to get alignment, to say, well, this is what we're talking about. This is the area we want your brain to function in. Now we're going to talk about context. We're going to use those rules that we've gotten you to think about, and now we're going to present them in a contextual space, give them meaning, and avoid other meanings that they don't relate to. And now we can start talking about specifics, details, content. Now that's the very raw principle of it that we've already talked about. But the logic that we're using must be built upon existing logic step by step. And if they don't have existing knowledge or logic to build upon for the final idea, we need to give them that. This is one of the areas where a lot of people go wrong looking to influence someone else. They start at the end. They start at the finish line. They start with the outcome. So I want this outcome. I want to try and convince you that this is a great idea. Whereas where they should be starting is way back in the beginning. And if we get stuck, if it's not working, if we're not immediately seeing the degree of influence from persuasion that we're looking for, we want to avoid falling into other tools and methods like manipulation and coercion. Has anyone got any others that anyone wants to add? Feel free to throw the comments up. We'll have a talk about it. Gaith's just saying a comment earlier that we talked about threshold concepts, saying it's right that you don't unlearn something. However, the power of going back to bad habits is very strong. How do you go about trying to prevent that from happening? That's a good question. So if we talk about, for example, these persuasion principles, let's say that you look at some of these and you think, well, yeah, this is great. I really should be doing more of this. I understand it. I've got the threshold concept. I know that this stuff is useful and a good way of going about obtaining influence through persuasion. How do I avoid habits of falling back into techniques like manipulation and coercion? Well, there's two big things. One is, what are your reasons for this? Your reasons for any change of habit have to be strong and powerful. You have to have and have to acknowledge to yourself that you have enough of a powerful reason that, yes, you want to change whatever habits. So understand the habits that you have, understand that the habits that you want to have, acknowledge that there's a difference, find that your reasons for change, if the reasons are big enough, then you need to replace the habit. There's an argument that says you cannot break a habit. It's technically impossible. What you're actually needing to do is replace one habit with another. Because the human nature is to function or to perform with the least amount of cognitive effort as possible, that is the role of habit. Habit is to allow us to function without unnecessary or undue cognitive effort. So habits create this subconscious or subliminal mental process that allows us to do things pretty much the same as we've done them before, because that's less to think about. So you can't not do that. You can't say, well, I'm going to purposefully think about each time I do this, because you will, by human nature, fall back to a habit of some kind, especially when your brain is busy with other things, especially when your subconscious is busy with other things. So the point is, create new habits, and you create new habits through repetition. So for a period of time, and it's usually a number of weeks, you will need to focus every opportunity you can, make that conscious mental effort to adopt the ideas, the principles, and it doesn't matter what part of the communications that we might have covered that you want to adopt as a new habit. The process that you'd want to go through is intensively, for a short period of time, repeat the new behavior again and again and again. Be prepared for it not to work. Be prepared to fall back into old habits occasionally. Catch yourself. Don't think about the old habits. Don't think about what you're not trying to do. Just focus on how you do want to go about it and focus on your reasons for that. Here's a poll. Let's throw up this question. Think about all those times when people have tried to influence you and you weren't convinced. You weren't impressed. They failed to achieve the influence that they were looking for. What was the biggest reason for that? Let's throw the poll up. Have a think. What are the best answers? Now, I know a lot of you are going to be looking at this and saying, well, wish I could pick 3 or 4 of these. Unfortunately, you're going to have to pick one. What's the biggest reason? We'll just let that tick through for a few minutes. We've got half the people that have voted already. We're starting to see a clear winner already. Keep in mind, if you've got any thoughts and comments on any of the stuff we've put up already, if you're waiting for a moment whilst we're just going to wait till we get to about 3/4 voting before we put this up. Throw your comments up there in the questions box. We'll go over that. Navjeev's just asking, are there tricks to building such habits? Tricks, no. Formula, yes. Formula is what we've just talked through. The formula is keep track of your reasons for doing so and constantly work at repetitiously doing the right thing for a short period of time. Make it the new habit. There's no shortcut, I guess, if that's what you're looking for. No, there's no shortcut. There are ways in which you can think about it more effectively. You can use subconscious affirmations because part of your subconscious is always thinking about it. So you can have the good old post-it notes stuck around your desk or in different places that says the sorts of things that you want your subconscious to see. You'll stop seeing it consciously, but part of your subconscious will pick it up. That will work more or less effectively for different people. These are just tools to keep part of your brain constantly thinking about the new behavior. That's really all it is. There's no substitute for having the discipline of saying, well, I'm just going to make the effort that every time this comes up, I'm going to think about my reason for change and the way in which I want to change. So I don't know if you'd call those tricks. They're sometimes tools, methods, but no shortcuts to the hard work of changing a habit, I'm afraid. The brain is stubborn. So let's close this poll now and throw it up and have a bit of a talk about these answers. There we go. Right, 42%. They assumed I would see it from their perspective. That's a big winner. And it's really not surprising. Why is this the biggest reason why other people cannot influence us? And if you think about those of you who've listened to the pre-recorded audio, in my view, the single biggest aspect of what that discussion is all about is perspective. If you want to influence someone else's thinking, you want to change their brain, which means you need to understand their brain. You need to change their thinking by understanding their thinking. So you're not going to change something else by focusing on something different. Work on the thing that you want to change, and that is their decisions, their belief, their ideas, their thought patterns. So if that's what you're influencing, that's what you want to think about. That's the point. So it can be as simple as an acknowledgement and awareness of saying, well, okay, fair enough. If their thought processes is the thing I'm going to want to change, then really I should be starting from understanding their thought processes. I mean, that's pretty straightforward logic. But why do many of us forget that? Why do we not think of that perhaps as much as we should? Why do other people? Usually it's because of the motivation factor. The reason we want to share our ideas is the difference between expression and outcome. And this is a bit of an undercurrent that runs back through all of the other things we've talked about for the last 3 weeks. We talked about this in social media. We raised the question. Social media is a lot about being a tool for expression. It's just getting stuff out there. We want to tell the world about stuff. We want ourselves externalized. We want ourselves to be seen or to be perceived as bigger. We want to be on the stage. We want a bit of spotlight. We want a bit of exposure. We want us magnified. These are all natural human conscious phenomena that we think about when we want to express ourselves. When we want to influence someone else, that need to express ourselves can get in the way. And if we allow our need to express, it means that our excitement, our enthusiasm will step forward and say, well, this is my view of the world, and I'm going to give you my view of the world, and I'm going to hope and assume that my view is so powerful and compelling, just like it was for me, that you'll just fall right into step with it. But in logical sense, that's not how the other person's brain is going to work, because that's not how your brain worked. That's not how you or we typically came to our conclusions. Let's try and get a little bit practical with this now. Let's shift this. I'm going to hide this, and we'll go back to our slides. Whilst we do that, Emily's just asking a question. Emily says, I have a question about a work situation common in her workplace. They don't give me enough information about the job on hand, makes it hard to align with them. How can I give them information about what they're doing? So this sounds like a situation for Emily where she's not getting enough information to be functional and effective. Not enough information. Well, I think this is an echo of Emily is not really being sufficiently persuaded that she needs to do certain things in order to achieve and accomplish. She's not getting enough information. She's not convinced of exactly what the expectations are and how she needs to go about getting things done. So if we link that into what we're talking about here with persuasion, if someone is trying to persuade you and it's not working and they're using the wrong techniques, then as you think about these things and as people come to you in the coming days and weeks, you will see what they're doing wrong and you'll be more mindful and more aware of it. So these things will be more relevant to you. There is no substitute for simple, direct feedback. And the two parts of the feedback is, one is the consequence and the other is the influence. So the consequence at the moment is that I'm investing a great deal of my time and effort in resolving confusion, misunderstanding, and lack of information. So a large part of my productivity right now is getting spent on this. I'm not comfortable with losing so much productivity in clarifying information, instructions, and objectives. Can we find a way to ensure that I get a more adequate set of information so that I don't need to lose my time and effort? Now, those words might not work for you. That kind of discussion might not work for you. But what we're doing here is we're trying to say, well, consequences are the starting point. Outcome is the starting point. What's the starting point of this? Lost productivity, lost effectiveness, lost efficiency. Now, we could start at the other end and say, you're not giving me enough information. That comes across more as a accusation, complaint, criticism. Perhaps even a disclaimer for something that comes later that says, and therefore I couldn't get half this stuff done. So it's what we lead with that kind of makes the difference. And to that extent, what we're talking about with persuasion is similar. It's what we lead with that makes the most difference. It's where we start that kind of matters. And where we start is different with persuasion when it comes to convincing someone of something that they don't yet currently understand. Let's look at questions specifically as a tool and a technique. If there's anything that you might say as a silver bullet for this kind of problem, I would say it's questions. Questions are extremely powerful tools in the role of communications. They're generally quite disarming. It's difficult for most people to feel threatened or to feel challenged by questions. Now, certainly some questions can do that, we know that, but in comparison to statements, questions are generally much more disarming, and they're engaging because a question, by its very nature, triggers thought. It triggers investigation. It triggers an internal analysis, an internal question, even when they know the answer. The brain has to dig for the answer, and it will test, is this the right answer for this question? So it engages the brain in a very different way, a way which makes it, pardon me, a way which makes it difficult for negative reactions to come first. So questions are much more effective at avoiding argument, debate, rejection, reaction. You ask somebody a question, you're far more likely to get an answer than an argument. You give someone a statement, you've got a much higher chance of getting an argument. You can't really get an answer because you're only going to get an answer if you asked the question. So the issue then is, what do you want from this person? Do you want an argument or do you want an answer? It's going to shape whether or not you use a question. We can't help but think about the answer when we get asked a question. I mean, you think about what happens in your own mind. Every time I ask a question, just in this setting, in what we're going through here, what goes through your own mind? I mean, some of you might be only partially tuned in, but even then, part of your mind is thinking about that question. And it doesn't matter what the context or the situation is, we just can't resist. We can't help ourselves. It triggers a degree of curiosity. Now, obviously, that's going to tap into whatever natural curiosity we have about the content of the topic, etc. And a few people commented over the last couple of weeks that some of what we've talked about has triggered curiosity for them. And the same thing will occur throughout the day, throughout the week in your professional environment. There'll be things that trigger curiosity. So if we want to influence someone else, a good starting point would be to try to understand what they are curious about. And if we don't know, maybe we should ask them. Questions, once again, useful things. So questions become an invitation. They are a welcoming process to welcome someone into a discussion which might actually lead somewhere very different. Statements are something you can walk away from. Statements are something that's presented in front of you. Not always a barrier, but they're not the same open door, comfortable chair that we get from questions. Questions are an opportunity to express oneself. Now, we've just talked about this a moment ago. There is an element of the human condition, the human psyche, that says that there is a need within ourselves to express ourselves. So the use of questions taps into that need and gets people around us to express themselves. And when they do that, certain endorphins are triggered inside the brain, certain feel-good chemicals swim around between the brain cells, and we are responsible for that. And they associate that good sensation with the fact that we've just asked them a question that they've enjoyed answering, even to the smallest extent. All positive goodness reciprocation going on because we asked a question and not a statement. Think about the last time you were at a party. You're standing there in the corner with your drink, bump into a few other people, some of which you don't really know very well, and somebody is just talking about them. They're talking about what they did. They're talking about their kids. They're talking about their party last week. They're talking about their job, and they just won't stop, right? A funny little anecdote comes up, and you've got some extra thing you want to add that happened to you last week about that, and you just can't get a word in. You'd love to express yourself, to participate in that part of the conversation, but there's no room. So think about what reactions does that cause for us? And then conversely, think about the person that's pausing and says to you, what happened to you with that last week? Or they simply sense the fact that you're trying to interrupt and they ask you the question. or they open the door for you. Exactly how we do it is all a bit different, but these mechanics of communication are ones that we're all very familiar with and have been working with for most of our lives. But we're not always consciously aware of exactly the cause and effect of how they work or don't work for us. So 3 different kinds of questions. Let's break them down functionally into 3 different kinds of questions. And many of you will have heard and understood this before. Open questions, we know what they are. Those are the questions that allow an open answer. Open questions are questions that give a lot of freedom to the person that we're asking the question to. They allow a wide range of responses, but because of that, they give us very little control about what happens next. Asking someone, what did you do on the weekend, means that really we probably don't know much about what we're going to get as an answer. Closed questions do the opposite. They generally have a very narrow range of answers. Sometimes it's merely yes or no. Closed questions are nailing down a particular point. They're an affirmation. They're a confirmation. They're an explicit alignment. Did you go to a picnic on the weekend? Yes or no? A short answer of no means they didn't go to a picnic, but it doesn't give an opportunity to tell them, for them to tell us about the theatre that they went to, which was far more exciting for them than the picnic. Control questions. These are the tricky ones. Control questions are a kind of questioning technique that is meant to give us a degree of control and influence over the way in which the conversation is going, but without closing it down to simple yes-no answers. So, leading questions, framed questions, questions like, did you go to the picnic, is a closed question, yes or no. Questions like, did you know about the picnic on the weekend? Sounds like a yes-no, but it's also an invitation to elaborate. It's not contextually finite. It allows an answer which then gives us the opportunity to expand upon the question. So control questions, they're meant to control the conversation, the thread of the discussion. They do it by giving us more flexibility in what we say or ask next, and they give the other person flexibility, but still within a topical context. Another chap that was around in a similar era, actually, to John Hancock, a Frenchman. A French writer, was Voltaire, said, not his, I'm forgetting his full name actually, Francois-Marie something or other, Aurier, I think, or something. I'm not French, so I'm probably pronouncing that very poorly. He said, judge a man by his questions rather than his answers. Simple statement of implying that how and what we ask of others is a much greater indicator of who and what we are and how we think and the kind of person we are than about how we express ourselves. So let's go through a very particular, specific model, formula, framework, a sequence of questions. We talked about logical progression. We've talked about using questions. We've talked about working with facts. We talked about focusing on the other party's mindset. Let's now look at a very practical series of steps that are hopefully going to let us do exactly that, and that's spin. Now, anyone who's done a lot of sales training, who's done solution selling, might have encountered spin. We are, in fact, borrowing the core essence of these techniques straight out of complex selling. So these are techniques that are used by experienced and capable salespeople for selling vastly expensive and complex and even small and simple solutions in between businesses around the world. So the reason we're borrowing this, the reason we're tapping into it, is because the principles in it have their foundation in the way we think, the way the human mind works, the way professional thinking in a professional context tends to make decisions, and the way influence comes about. So the principles of spin. Well, we're talking about spin principles. We're really talking about 4 different kinds of questions. And we're going to elaborate on each of these in a little bit of detail as we go through it. So it's not just this one slide. We're going to have a slide on each type of question to help explain and contextualize them a little bit better. If anyone has any thoughts and comments as we go through this, throw them up in the questions box and we'll tackle it as it arises. So we're talking about spin as being a series of questions. You could call it an investigation sequence. You could call it a discussion. Core part of it is that they are, in fact, questions. So nearly the entire process is about asking questions and about asking the right questions. It gives you some idea as to how much this principle believes in and subscribes to the idea that questions are the most powerful tool in persuasion. Situation questions are followed by problem questions, followed by implication, and then need payoff. And yes, I thought this too when I saw this. I thought, wow, you know, they really struggled to find something to start with the word end, didn't they? If they weren't worried about the acronym, they probably would have used vision questions. But SPIV doesn't sound quite as cool, right? Remember, this is a principle that was originally devised by a research organization that then went out and created a sales training business as a result. So they had to have something suitably catchy. They've changed it now, I believe. They no longer call it spin because it's starting to sound like manipulation. We now associate the word spin with the trickery. So it's an evolving term, but it's still useful for our purposes here. We're not thinking of it in terms of trickery. So let's go through them. Situation questions. What's this all about? The point about situation questions is quite simply to understand the situation, but not just for us to understand it, because we may well have some existing knowledge, but we may well also have some assumptions. But the other party will have their assumptions and their knowledge, and we need to line them up. We need to get alignment of what exactly we are going to talk about here. So if we've got some grand proposal that we want to put to the boss or to the board of directors, or something we want to put out there that says, we've got a great idea and we're hoping you all will buy into this idea. Well, let's first set the parameters of what this next discussion will entail. What are we talking about? Well, maybe we're talking about changing the phone system at the company. Maybe we're talking about moving offices. Maybe we're talking about hiring a team of people. Maybe we're talking about engaging this external company to provide some service that we want. Whatever the issue is, there's going to be some parameters which will define the boundaries of what it is and is not. And the whole point about defining boundaries is for the point of focus. It allows us to, and allows the other party, to focus their attention on what really matters. And therefore, in that process, forget about everything else. So they're not left thinking, is it this or is it this? Is it something else or is it something else? No, we're being clear on that through a series of questions. Now, you could say, well, why don't we just make these as statements? You know, we're saying, well, here's a statement. We want to talk about this. Okay, that's probably a good start. But what about all of the parameters surrounding this? Here's the thing. If we go forward and say, okay, so we want to talk about let's pick the phone system. Okay, our big idea is to change the phone system for our company because it's old and horrible. Well, we think it is. Well, that's a simple statement to begin with, but exactly how many phones are there in the company? How many people have phones on desks? How many inbound lines do we have? How many phone calls come in per day? How many phone calls go out per day? How many phone calls get transferred between staff per day? How many messages get left? Do we leave messages on the phone? How many desks have a phone but no people? How many people have a desk but no phone? Now, not all of this is going to be relevant, but many of these points will be. So the situation questions give us the opportunity to talk to someone who probably has some knowledge about this and confirm what we know and what we believe and ask the questions when we don't know. So it confirms our understanding, and it demonstrates to other parties that we have this understanding, but it also demonstrates to them that we are looking to have a complete, clear and aligned understanding, and that's our purpose in these questions. We want to just openly agree what is the situation we're talking about. There's no trickery in this. There's no need for it. There's no reason for us or them to be at all shy about uncovering what is the situation. It's neutral. It doesn't influence anything just yet. But it does get rid of the assumptions. Brings clarity. Because if we don't, if we leave these assumptions in there, then there's a chance that they'll bite us later when we start to talk about the far more serious and far more consequential aspects of the discussion. So it's just for contextual alignment of what's to come. Let's just be clear on what we're talking about. And whatever details that matter, let's line them up. So let's say we've got that. Now we get to the interesting stuff. We're starting to talk about the exciting things now. We're going to talk about problems. Now, here's a question for you all to answer. You can just answer within yourselves. At this point, how many people do you know start to tell you what the problem is? How many people in your organization or that you work with, if it was their idea to want to change the phone system, how many of them would lead with, well, let me tell you what's wrong with the phone system today? Lots of them? Some of them? Most of them? All of them, perhaps? My view, my guess, is that most of you would probably agree with me if I said that starting with a statement of what they think the problem is the way most people would go at this point in trying to persuade. This is backed up by the research that Huthwaite did when they were developing this system that found that something like 70 or 80% of people do have this approach. They begin with the idea of, I'm going to tell you what the problem is. And we'll lead on, we'll talk more about that later. Spin is saying, no, we don't want to tell people what the problem is, because then that's a statement, right? That's something that they can argue with. That's something they can disagree with. That's something they can debate. Ask them, what's the problem with the phone system? What problems do you have with the phone system? Do you have problems with the phone system? Might be a better start. Now, here you can have questions about, or control questions that say, well, do you have a problem with this kind of thing? Or what kind of problems do you have with messages being left? That's a control question. You're not saying, do you have problems with the phone system? That's very open. But what kind of problems do you have with messages being left is a control question in that it narrows the answer towards talking about messages and problems with them. But it still gives flexibility and creativity in the answer. But without a problem, without a motivation to do something, then there's not going to be any persuasion. So regardless of how clever and capable and whatever we are from this point, if nobody that we want to persuade can see or believe that there is any reason or any problem with our phone system, they're definitely not going to be persuaded to buy a new one. And we need to accept this fact as a starting point. We need to accept the fact that there isn't going to be an influence on anything unless there is pain, unless there's a need for something, unless there's a problem and we can unlock and build alignment on that problem, there isn't going to be any influence. There isn't going to be any change. So you think about some of those scenarios that hopefully have been popping into your head about those moments where people have failed to influence you. Perhaps some of them failed to influence you because there was just no reason to do anything at all. Somebody had a great idea and you might be thinking to yourself, well, they think that there's something there to be done, but I just don't think there's a reason to do anything. So it doesn't matter what solution they propose, I'm not going to be impressed because I don't think there's a problem to fix. So if we really want to find out what problems exist, if we really want to find out what opportunities for influence might exist, we have to have a degree of honest curiosity. We have to think from a consultative point of view, put your consultant hat on and think, well, let's find out what really the problem is in their own words, from their perspective. Remember, we've already wrestled with the fact that in communication, it's really all about them. In persuasion, it's no different. In sales, it's no different. And we need our honest curiosity because it's disarming. If we ask a leading question that says, So tell me, you got problems with the phone system, huh? Tell me all about them. Lots of problems? They're probably going to get the impression that we're leading them on the answer, and they'd be right. Honest curiosity tackles it very differently. Honest curiosity allows for any possible answer without a reaction on our part. Because as we said, if we get the kind of answers that suggest that there's just nothing doing, then we really should be investing our energy in trying to influence something else, because this isn't going to happen. But occasionally, hopefully, you get revelations and discoveries. You get things that come out of it. You get people saying, well, yeah, we have these problems and we have those problems, and this would be better if we'd like to have this fixed, and this isn't very good. Sometimes through this process, there's a little discomfort that comes out of it, because there's an acknowledgement, there's an admission, there's an awareness that things aren't perfect. And part of the brain's defense mechanism, or part of our psyche's defense mechanism at avoiding negative feelings, is to not think too much about things that are negative. It's just a natural part of suppressing those thoughts, because they're generally unpleasant. They create different chemicals in the brain. So problems that I can't deal with right now are generally put aside. Why? Because if I'm constantly wrestling with all the problems I can't solve, I'm generating stress. I'm generating psychological stress. I'm generating biophysical stress. And there's been many studies that have made it clear to us today that we will actually become physically unwell if we allow ourselves to wrestle too much with problems that we can't fix. So they need to be brought to the surface. And the reason we're bringing them to the surface here is because ultimately we feel that we've got some solution. Our great idea might solve some of these. But let's find out what they really are first. So we uncover an implied need. Why is it called an implied need? Well, we don't know how to fix it yet. We know there's a need in the context of being something that's wrong, something that's undesirable. It could be a missed opportunity, or it could be something we want to remove or avoid or prevent. Dale's just saying he's seen the same techniques given for performance management, so they can have a wide application. I mean, I think they can have an extremely wide application, because I think what we're talking about with this model is nothing more than just the way the brain functions. Implication questions. What do these do? Well, main purpose of discussing implications is to build a motivation. The whole point about implication is the cost of not fixing the problem. So, okay, we've talked about the problem. But do we need to do anything about that? Yeah, we have some problems with messaging and calls getting dropped and a few things like that. But, should we bother? Really? Can we just end this conversation now and forget about it? Because, well, maybe not. Let's ask the implication questions. How many phone calls do actually drop during a given day? Actually, it's quite a few. How many of those are customers? Quite a few. How many of those are customers? How many of those calls from customers in the last 6 months are no longer customers? Well, that question might take a little bit of digging, but the answer would be quite interesting. Just an example of the kind of things that we're going to go through with implication questions. It's all about, what does it cost you? How bad is it really? So we use this because the next stage of the discussion, which we're about to talk about, is a little bit more difficult. It's the hardest stage for many people on both sides of the discussion. And there's often a little bit of inertia, a bit of reluctance to move into the next phase. But if there's an increased awareness that, hang on, there's something here that's actually worth fixing, something that's big enough, bad enough, ugly enough, hairy enough, that we've got to do something about something. We don't know what that something is yet. But yeah, okay, these implication questions have revealed and uncovered that there's going to be an expense. We are suffering expense right now. We're suffering costs because of our inaction, because we haven't solved this. So yeah, there's going to be costs if we try and fix it. Of course there are. But now we've got something to balance those costs against. How many times have many of you seen a proposal in a business context that's got dollar figures against it? And what's everyone thinking about? Well, that's a lot of money. How well have we understood, discussed, and explored the fact that if we don't spend this money, we may be losing much more than that on a regular basis. Now, intellectually, we know that that's really the equation. We know that that's the comparison. We know that's the decision. But if we bring all of it to the surface because we've been asking the right questions, then it's all available to us as influence. It's all part of our persuasion. It's all relevant. So remember, persuasion we talked about, presentation of facts. Well, let's present all the relevant facts and they'll get taken into account. How many proposals out there that were really good ideas, and yeah, they kind of looked expensive in terms of cost, but really they should have been adopted because the cost of not doing it was significantly higher, but that wasn't properly presented and so it got rejected. We've seen that happen, right? So this builds motivation to invest in some kind of solution to the problems that we've already talked about. Now, if we pause here for a moment and look at the sequence that we've gone through, ask yourself, could you have done this in any other order? Could you have talked about the problems before you talked about the situation? No. You need to understand the parameters before you understand what's wrong with them. Could you have talked about the implications prior to the problems? Well, no. The implications are about the problems. There is a distinct logical sequence. You can't do these in a different order. Let's look at the last set of questions. Need payoff questions. Vision questions, the other good name for them. So this is a what-if stage. There's still questions. Now, here, assuming you've got to this part in the process, you might be thinking, oh, great, you know, they can see what the problem is. They agree with me that this is a problem. They agree with me it needs to be fixed. Now I can jump in and tell them how to fix it. No. No, what we're trying to do now is the most important part. Now, that's interesting that we say that because for some of you, you might be thinking, well, you know, this has already gone a lot further than most people tend to do in my organization in terms of uncovering real reasons to do stuff. How could this next part be more important? Well, this is the part that gets you the yes answer. This is the part that makes it your good idea that gets persuaded, that you get the influence. So how do we do it? The what-if stage. What if we had phone systems that let each person take a message at their own desk? What if we had a decentralized phone-by-phone message management system? Well, yeah, that'd be good. But that would mean that this would happen and this wouldn't happen and this would be better and this would be easier. What if we could transfer calls to any office in the country? Well, yes, that'd be good because this, and this. So this is what we mean by the what if. What if we had this? Now, sometimes the what if will be met with, no, that wouldn't really solve it. That's good. That's a good answer because you say, oh, so what would solve that? Gives the other party the opportunity to say, well, yeah, if we had this and this, that would fix it. That would be useful. Now what are they doing? Well, yes, they're building a vision of a possible solution, but they're telling you what they want. They're telling you that if they had this, it would fix this problem that they think is worth fixing because of the implications of not fixing it, and they're defining what the solution needs to be. Now, you're possibly guiding that with a bit of, oh, what if this, what about this, what if you had one of those? Now, presumably, those what-if control questions that you're throwing out there are things that you already have as part of your grand idea because you've already been through this thought process that you're guiding someone else through. But they are involved. Now, this is why it's so crucial. When someone in this discussion is saying, well, yeah, that and that you've mentioned is a good idea, but that other part is not. But if we had this, this, and this with it, then that would be really good. If we could do all this sort of stuff, what are they doing? It's their idea now. It's their vision of the solution. And the most astounding thing about that is that later on, they're not going to tell you that they've got a bad idea. They're not going to tell you that, oh, no, we're not going to do that because, you know, that was a lousy idea from me to suggest all that stuff. No, we wouldn't have that. Of course not. They're going to be saying, well, you know, this is, I've devised this solution. This is now my idea. They are emotionally invested in a problem that they already know needs to be solved is worth solving. But because you're asking the questions, it's aligned with your idea, your proposal. Now, finally, we can turn around and say, well, if I put together a proposal for you that outlined exactly how I think we could solve all these problems and do all of this, would you like to see that? Sure, I'd love to see that. That'd be good. Well, here's one I prepared earlier. Maybe not. Maybe you at least looked like you went back and thought about what they'd said. Come back and say, well, here's a quick proposal on replacing our phone system, taking into account all of the problems that you've told us or that you've said exist, taking into account all of your reasons, and from reasons, from the implications, we get prioritization as well. Some things are more expensive and more important than others. And given your description of the vision of what would actually solve those problems, here is the proposal. Here is the idea. So, theoretically, we haven't actually told them anything. We haven't said anything. We possibly haven't made a single statement. We haven't done any of the things that we might normally associate with trying to be persuasive. We haven't used a silver tongue. We haven't used trickery. We haven't threatened. We haven't used their emotions at all. Well, we've used a little bit of their emotion. We've used a bit of their excitement. We've used a bit of their ownership. We might have used a bit of their fear when it came to the implications. But we've got to a point where we have been able to persuade someone to do something because we've presented the facts in a logical sequence that allows them to sequentially become aware of the kinds of things that they need to be aware of in order to see the value in our idea. Now that might sound like a long and lengthy process, and for something like changing of a major business system, it probably would be. But in terms of deciding what to do for lunch, you'd probably condense that quite a bit. Maybe you wouldn't even go so far. But the point is, it could be applied in a wide variety of circumstances. And I can tell you by personal experience, despite knowing and understanding these principles, it can be a challenge to remember to use them all the time. We are instinctive human beings. We tend to function within the rules of our own brain, and we do so whether we like it or not. And as what we talked about before with the habits and changing habits and thinking about this differently, it can be a challenge, especially if you don't sell for a living and don't go through these steps for a living on a regular basis. It can be difficult to remember to think about these things. Now, this isn't a bulletproof formula that you're just going to apply, add water, and get your answers and your influence. It's simply a set of principles that might, hopefully, shape how you go about the process of convincing others of the value of what you say. Where you start, the journey you take, and where you finish up. Let's line these points, these ideas, up against the vectors that we've talked about before. And we talked about intellectual change, emotional change, and motivational change. What we know, how we feel about it, and what we're going to do about it. How does this line up in persuasion? Well, the intellectual change is all about knowing the reasons, knowing the logic. It's about understanding the situation and the problem. What is the reason to change? Because in general, any good idea, any presentation, any proposal, anything that you want to convince someone else of is going to involve a change in them or a change from them, a change by them. There will be change. There will be some kind of activity, investment, outcome. Ergo, change. So the intellectual vector, the intellectual concept is to say they need to know the reasons for that change. They need to understand those reasons. But then they need to feel the pain. They need to be aware of the pain of the present, aware of the pain of not changing, aware of the pain of the status quo, the current situation. But we haven't yet told them which direction to go. They haven't even told us which direction to go. We're not at that stage yet. That comes next. The motivational vector, the motivational change, where they actually take action, is when they own the answer, because they've been involved in creating it. It's partly their answer and partly yours. So a big question that comes out of this is, what would we rather have? Would we rather have our big idea accepted by management or by others, that have them turn around and say, look, Fred and Mary come up with this really good idea, and congratulations to them, and we've all been so impressed that we were convinced that we have to do this. And it's fortunate that Fred and Mary are here to help us with these problems, or we'd be lost. Doesn't usually happen like that. What usually happens is that Fred and Mary put forward this great idea, and somebody else with the power and the influence and the decision turns around and says, look, Fred and Mary made me aware of some things, and we've decided to do this. And I have this great idea of what to do about it. Now, sometimes you've got to make a decision as to what you're going to be satisfied with. And if the result is what matters, then the process is what matters. So I want to throw up a suggestion to you of what the threshold concepts might be for today, for this discussion. So we talked about threshold concepts for previous weeks, and hopefully some of those resonated with some of you. And I want to put this up to see what you think of these points about persuasion and buy-in. We're saying that persuasion is a logical journey of thought. It is a process. It's not an event. It's not a one-off thing. And it works best through origination. That's all about, they have to have some input into the idea. It will be far more likely to give you influence and persuasion if they can have a sense of ownership in the origination, the creation of the idea. And it's not blunt. It's not direct. It's subtle. It's subtle because it's not confrontational. It's explorative. It's inquisitive. It uses curiosity rather than force of argument. It doesn't charge headfirst into the opposition and then try to use logic as a weapon to batter down their arguments and leave them with nothing else but the reluctant agreement that, well, I guess if all our arguments have been defeated, perhaps we'd best go along with this idea. That's not what this persuasion is all about. Persuasion is about having an idea, having a view, knowing how that view is structured in your own mind, allowing someone else to be exposed in the same logical, structured way to your idea, and inviting them to agree with you in a way that allows them to collaborate on the formation of a slightly new idea, combining their input and yours. Now, we haven't had as many questions tonight, and I'm not sure why that is. Perhaps that we've been entirely too clear and succinct about everything, or perhaps the opposite. Perhaps we've not created enough opening. We've not triggered enough thought for questions, etc. So let that be an encouragement. If anyone's got any, or we have a bit of time left. We have, in fact, allowed a bit of extra time for the questions. So we've got that little bit of a buffer here now where, as you can see by the slide deck, we've reached the end of the slide presentation. I do want to put this point out, though, whilst some of you are hopefully thinking of some comment or whatever to put in. St. Augustine is someone who lived an awful long time ago, 4th and 5th century. He was an early Christian theologian, and he said, the words printed here are the concepts, but you must go through your own experiences. And that, I believe, applies to pretty much everything. And everything that we've talked about in the last 4 weeks, everything that you've listened to, everything that you've participated in, all the ideas that you've heard others throw around, etc., these are just concepts. But what matters is what they mean to you and what experiences you put them through. So the true test of all of this and the true relevance of it is how you use it, what you do with it, what makes sense to you. So we're merely offering these ideas and thoughts and concepts for you to take from them what little bits and pieces that you want or that you feel is interesting. So let's see if we've got any questions coming through. James, can I ask, have you got any questions at all there that, or are you struggling with an overload now? Are they bombarding you? What's happening with those questions? Have we got any we should talk about? Maybe James has fallen off. Let me just see if I can pull a couple out of the list here. Louisa is saying it's thought-provoking material. Louisa is saying a lot to take in, especially recognizing where I've made mistakes in trying to persuade in the past. Louisa, I think you're right. We are aware of the fact that this particular subject is chock-a-block. It is a foundation subject in the master's programs for the university. It is one of those, I guess you'd call them one of those tough subjects. This is only 4 of 10 topics. So participating in the full subject, although obviously it goes over a few months, there's lots to do. The good part about this subject from the university's point of view or from the student's point of view is that there's no big final exam. So there is a little exam just like what you guys are about to do next week, but the rest of it is practical. But yes, it is one of the more intense, full subjects that we've put together. So there is a lot to take in. And part of the reason I think there can be a lot to take in is because it's asking you to reconsider what you've been doing and thinking for so long. You know, it's questioning the habits, and it's asking you all to reconsider what is habit and what isn't. Bush is asking, will the presentation be available for download? Sorry, go ahead, James.
I'll just butt in here if that's all right. Sorry, it seems I was double muted before, so I thought I'd unmuted myself to give you a question, but I was still muted on my microphone on my headphones, which I hadn't realized. Sorry about that.
Right. Okay, we've got some questions popping up now. Sorry, I might not have scrolled the right way, James. I think I was missing a few questions here. Let me tackle the ones that I can see. Yeah, all right. Let me just tackle those and see how we go. Jafar saying very informative session. Andrew's saying new way of selling, hard enough face to face. It is. I mean, face to face. I think most persuasion is more effective face to face when we're able to present our body language and our person. We can be far more persuasive. It's a lot easier for a person to assess and truly judge the complexity of who and what we are as we say it. So it can be more effective in terms of its impact, but can also be much harder to deliver. We've got to think about a lot more of it. What's Gara saying? It's a logical flow of information that we can relate to. But and I think that's a good point. The listener has to be able to relate to the information. And this is one of the reasons why this principle focuses on the questions, because what better for them to relate to than information that they are intimately familiar with and that they are providing and contributing to the discussion. Daryl's just commenting, been thinking about barriers that I've encountered which have meant that I've not fully used the techniques in the past and how I might be able to improve. I mean, a lot of this that we've talked about, not just tonight, but over the last few weeks, a lot of it, some of you might be thinking and nodding, yeah, okay, that makes sense, that can make sense. But when we're honest with ourselves and we look back at it and think, well, do we really use this to the extent that we could? And if not, well, why not? Is it because we really, don't care quite so much about what happens with our communication? Well, that's probably not true. Are we perhaps not thinking enough about the full extent of the consequences of how we communicate and how thoroughly we apply ideas and principles, etc.? To me, it comes down to a personal standard. It's a personal attitude that we have towards communications. And some people are quite happy with just cruising through a mediocre outcome of communications. Generally, it does its job, right? And usually, if it's not, we can fix it. So you need a reason to want to rise above that. And I'm not encouraging or suggesting that any of us should have any more reasons than are within us. And, you know, some of what we've talked about might have triggered a few thoughts. And if you just look at how you see other people's communications fail around you and just think, well, these are examples of other people's communications that I don't want to emulate. You know, I think of what they've done and how they haven't got it, or they could have got it better, or haven't done it right. And I don't want other people to be thinking that way about my communications. I want them to be just working with it. What else we got? A comment from Gabe saying, what if this is not really a discussion and more of a feedback period? They're asking for staff input, i.e. we can't formulate it in a discussion method. Can we put the what-ifs and the proposal all in one? Well, Gath, I guess it depends. If you're talking about a situation where someone else has invited you and they're controlling the format. So this format, this formula, does assume that you are the initiator of the format of the discussion. So you have a degree of control over the nature and structure of how the conversation goes. Well, it's not always the case. So if you're talking about a situation where, let's say, you get pulled into a scenario, a situation, or a discussion, and you've got to try and fabricate out of that a reasonable kind of persuasion to try and have influence. I would still say that questions are aligned with influence, because if you get 5, 10 people in a room and lots of people are throwing up their good ideas, and one person is quietly in the corner asking lots of good questions in the first half of the discussion, and then subsequently come out with other things later, a lot of people are going to be aware of the fact that they've clearly and obviously done digging, researching, investigation. They have considered their views, whereas other people have brought in prefabricated views. That does come across differently. So you're talking about perhaps, I'm presuming from what you've said here, you're talking about a situation where you're not in control of the structure and flow of things, but the principles still apply. It might be a lot harder for you to enact them when you're not in control of things, but still encouraging the investigation element, finding the logical flow, talking about the problems. If you're asked your view, what's your view on this? Well, you could just give your view. Or you could use this logical sequence and say, well, because of these problems and these implications of those problems, which suggest that it is a problem worth solving, therefore I would suggest that this kind of response or these steps or this kind of solution would be a place to start. Which is different from saying, well, I think we should just get a new phone system. Why? Well, because, you know, it's the old one's rubbish. It's no good. No good being a technical term. Christine saying, great session, easy to relate to the industry. Realised how much the senior people actually use forms of influence and power of questions. You know, you find a lot of people do this stuff instinctively. You know, if you look around your environment and you'll think about those people who are typically influential and who have persuasion, you'll probably see some parallels, and a lot of them won't even know. I mean, when Huthwaite did this research into understanding how the best salespeople in the world sell, most of the time the salespeople couldn't tell them. They didn't know. They didn't know what it was, and this is why the research took place. So the Huthwaite researchers literally tagged along to thousands of sales meetings and phone calls and presentations and you name it. And they found what was in common in the nature of the discussions that took place with those successful salespeople, those who were consistently successful. But most of them had no idea exactly why they were successful. Teresa's just saying there's a fine line when someone learned techniques like NLP, reading nonverbal communication, and is aware of cognitive theory, that it borders into manipulation, especially if your intended audience is not aware of those techniques, or is it not? So is this bordering upon manipulation and shady processes? If there's any flaw in the logic that you're using, yes. I mentioned earlier honest curiosity, and I think to me that's the crux of it. If you honestly want to find out what the person's problems really are, then you will. But if you only want to hear about stuff that's going to suit your argument later, then that's all you're going to listen for. That's what you're going to respond to. You can do it either way. These tools are just tools, and we can use them for whatever agenda. And, it's always possible to mix a bit of manipulation and coercion into this process of persuasion. But as a process by itself, no, it doesn't inherently have manipulation in it. In fact, as a process, it explicitly doesn't have manipulation in it, because as a process, it's saying find out, find the truth, accept the truth. As a process, it's saying if they say it's not a problem, then accept that it's not a problem. If they say it's not an implication, it's not expensive, then we have to accept that. And we have to be prepared to accept that. And when you think about the way this is presented in a sales context, when you're actually training salespeople, it's one of the first things that comes out is that part of this process is to tell you which sales to walk away from. Very valid and crucial skill for any professional salesperson, to know what they should walk away from. And you should know that ideally in the early stages. And the exact same thing applies if we're trying to convince anyone of anything. We're trying to get buy-in for any big idea. We've got to know when we need to go back to the drawing board, or when we need to just pull out of this idea because maybe it's not quite as hot as we thought it was. That's only going to happen if we're honest about it. We're honest about the questions we ask, and we're honest about the answers that we get. Peter's saying, just finished ITIL Foundation exam today. Congratulations, Peter. Hope you passed. Communication was key between the stages. Any topics from tonight relevant to ITIL concepts? None of this is going to be explicitly found as it is in ITIL, but you look at ITIL does have things that look at the psychology of satisfaction and service levels and what that does and how people respond to awareness of their of the service that they're receiving and compliance, and there's a variety of things that tap into psychological concepts. But I wouldn't say that they're necessarily the same. However, if you're in a kind of role or function that uses ITIL, then you're already in a situation where you're looking for formulas, you're looking for frameworks, you're looking for principles that are going to be a foundation set of rules and guidelines that you can then apply into a wide variety of interactive situations. So I would think a lot of it would sit parallel to this. But I wouldn't suggest that any of it is particularly more useful in an ITIL setting than any other setting. I mean, I would suggest that what we've talked about could theoretically be applied in pretty much any kind of department in any kind of industry. Really is that broad and universal. Dale's just asking, don't these techniques work best if not everyone is aware? I think from what I understand from what Daryl's saying, if people aren't aware of what you're doing. So would this work better for someone who hasn't listened to this? You know, if someone didn't know that they were getting spun, as it were, if we use it as a word in that context, would it work better on them or not? Well, yes and no. I've heard, I mean, we know that, you know, salespeople, sometimes salespeople are very hard to sell to, and sometimes salespeople turn out to be very easy to sell to. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about it. I would say that if people are aware of these principles themselves, then you could probably suggest that they are fundamentally aware of the value of the logical progression of the investigation. And if they are aware of that value, then they're going to probably participate constructively and positively, because if you're interested in the actual outcome, they're interested in the actual outcome, you can work collectively towards it. So someone who understands these principles and how they work, we've got to remember, someone who understands this knows that it's not manipulation. They know that they still have all the power. And they might be very happy to go through the spin process with you as a path of discovery, because they know that if at the end of this there isn't a big enough problem and the implications aren't big enough, then nothing's going to be bought, sold, transacted, no big ideas, no influence, no persuasion. We go back to square one. They know that just as well as we do. So there doesn't need to be any pressure on them. It's people who are less aware of the honesty of this process and who are somewhat fearful that they're being manipulated that might be more inclined to react negatively. And there are some sections in the implications. The further you go through, the more this is likely. So some people get a bit uncomfortable talking about problems because they talk about things that maybe they feel they should have fixed already. And some people get a bit worried when they start talking about the cost of those problems because it starts to suggest that maybe they're a failure, that they're not on the case, they're not doing their job because they're admitting that these big expensive problems still exist and they don't have a solution to it. And when it gets to the vision stage, to the payoff stage, they're even more aware that they've got these big problems, they should have solved them, they're pretty expensive, and you're about to fix it for them. That's how they might perceive it. When you get that kind of mindset, those people, that's when it can be the most challenging to keep this on track. And that's when you've got to be your most relaxed. That's when you have to really go hard onto the honest curiosity thing. Well, you know, we might not have an answer here. One of the best throwaway lines. There might not be a solution to this problem. Now, that person who's thinking, my goodness, I've got this expensive problem, why haven't I fixed it, the boss is going to kill me, suddenly thinks, well, okay, I've now got a good reason why this problem hasn't been solved. It's hard. It's too hard. We don't have an answer yet. Maybe we don't have an answer yet. And they can be somewhat comforted, I guess. It seems strange to say that they'd be comforted by the lack of an answer. I mean, the possibility exists that a half solution will get there. You know, there's usually some answer to the problem to some extent. Jafar's saying, in my opinion, for effective persuasion, there has to be a value proposition to the person or business. And I agree with you, Jafar, and I think one of the points about this model is that it's saying we don't open with the value proposition. We wouldn't begin this process unless we felt we had a value proposition. And part of the process here is to help the other party understand the need for this value proposition, and it's partly to help us adjust and fine-tune our value proposition. So at the end of it, the value proposition that we ultimately put on the table, that we did not put on the table up front, that we ultimately put on the table, is the most suited and aligned with our full and thorough and up-to-date understanding of exactly what they need, which they've helped us create. You couldn't get a better value proposition than this kind of model. That's what the model is saying. This is the best way to get the best value proposition. Absolutely. If you don't have one, then it is trickery. It is manipulation, coercion. Now we're running out of time, but I've got two more points here from people that I will mention. Steffi's just saying, what would be the best way of communication when you don't like the answer from your manager? In this case, you really believe that your answer is the correct one. So, Steffi, I'm going to extrapolate from your question saying, what happens when you're right and they're wrong and they're your boss? I guess that's a perennial question. It's a sort of problem that most of us have faced many times, sometimes far too often. I don't think the situation changes. The most important thing, though, that comes out of the relationship that you have with that person is how much time will they give you. Will they give you 10 minutes? Will they give you 20? Now, sometimes someone who is in a management, senior, supervisory position will give you time on the strength of wanting to help you understand things. And, you know, you can take that view of saying, well, look, can you spend 10 minutes, 20 minutes with me on this? I've got some questions. I'd love to go through and expand my understanding of it. Now, if they're a kind of person who, through the way their ego is structured, will find it hard to be influenced by you, they may be more likely to want to influence you. And they might give you that time and opportunity to ask questions, and then you go through the spin model. So you say, all right, so this is the situation. What are the problems here that's going on? And what's this? And what's this? And what are the implications of this? And what if we had one of these? Would this fix it? The point is, all through this, it's not your idea. Now, the kind of person in that situation who is fairly convinced that they're right, they're not comfortable listening to your ideas, but you're pretty sure that you've got a better one, they're the sort of person that you really need them involved in the vision statement, the vision stage, to build the vision, and they're probably the best way for you to be persuasive and get your outcomes is if they think it's all their idea. Sometimes it needs to be complete in that regard. But it doesn't change the process. What you've got to do is just get that conversation agreed upon. You're not going to have as much success, I don't think, is if you try and catch them in the corridor and say, look, just got some questions, about the situation. No, you need a bit of time. You need to go through the motions. And you need their agreement to go through a process. Keeping in mind, the process might be that you actually discover that they are more correct than you thought they were. You've got to at least have that possibility in your head. Otherwise, you won't do the process justice. And your preconceived ideas will be subconsciously visible. They'll spot it. They can tell, even if they don't know that they can tell. It'll come through in your body language, in your tone, and in your subtle sub-cues. There'll be something about it. You have to be just as ready to be influenced as you want them to be. Last question from Emily. Last comment from Emily. Another question, not from tonight's session. It's about emails, trying to avoid feelings like disappointment. How do you tell someone that they haven't been unsuccessful in something, but avoiding the reader's emotional reaction? Not sure if this is even possible. Put on the forum. I guess yes. Put it in the forums, Emily. I would encourage you to do that, mainly because I think that there's going to be a number of different aspects to the answer to this question, because this is a bit of a how-to question, and there's going to be some answers that hopefully some other people will throw in that are going to be suggestions and ideas, because I don't think there's a simple answer to how do you do this. I think there might be a few things to consider and keep in mind, but Emily, I would encourage you to throw that up in the forums, and I would encourage everyone else who's still tuned in to keep an eye out on the forums, tune in, give Emily some so that the benefit of your thoughts and ideas and all that. All right, well, we've gone a few minutes over. We will look to wrap it up now. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. Thanks for taking part. We've had a massive turnout in the webinars. We've had a very consistent turnout, which is very exciting for us. It's terrific to see people logging back in week after week, and that's very encouraging and exciting for us. There is going to be opportunities for feedback. We really love your feedback, all kinds of feedback. We'll put a post up on the forums for those that just want to informally put their comments in. And we'll also, I think they'll be sending out some sort of survey at some point, very brief and simple, just something that encourages you to give us your views on what you did or didn't like about what happened through this short course, because we're obviously constantly refining and doing this on an ongoing basis. And, we love to have the feedback from everyone as to how we can improve this. And also, we love it when we make a difference. So if you've got any happy stories about things that you have enjoyed or that has helped you or that you do appreciate, we love to hear that stuff as well, because it's great for us to know that the work and effort we put into this is helping out and making a difference to those people. But we'll wrap up for now. I'll sign off. Thanks again for everyone for tuning in. One more thing, the exam, the test, it'll be available approximately this time next week is when it'll become available. It'll be found on the portal. It'll be underneath week 4, so there's another section underneath that. There'll be a link. Look at the instructions, follow the instructions, click that. If you've got any questions about the exam or how it's going to work, throw it up in the forums. I'll put a post in there as a thread to go through, and we'll answer those questions there for everyone to see. But that's where you'll find it, and you'll find it in a week from now. That's all from me from now. Thanks very much. Good night.